Commander Asia TR letter 1ES7N stood at the rim of Copernicus crater, where the observation gallery bowed out over the moon's dust like an eyelid. The glass was a meter thick and black at the edges, but the stars still came through, hard and precise. 60 years had passed since the first alien transmission skimmed our ionosphere and turned myth into a radio problem. 60 years since Earth decided not to pick a side in wars we didn't understand. We watched, we learned, we built quietly. Asia remembered the history lectures from school, how democracies in the 20th century tried neutrality until submarines and atrocities snapped them out of it, how isolation was often a lullaby for the privileged. She did not repeat these to her crew. She only watched the thin needles of light where distant fleets dueled like frost joining cracks in glass. The galaxy burned politely far away. Outer array picking up an anomaly, Lieutenant Soren Patel said. His voice carried that soft mix of fear and hope that came with finally having a job to do. Gravimetric shear at 128 vector sunward. Big. What kind of big? Asia drifted from the window, boots finding their magnets. Show me the raw. The main screen preferred truth to pretty. A scar of heat and broken spin appeared, a vessel 3 city blocks long tumbling end over end, shedding panels and vapor like a comet with opinions. The signature looked hegemonic, layered armor, redundant spines, mass meant to scare asteroids. They don't leak, Soren whispered. They don't spin. Unless somebody broke their rules, Asia said. Trajectory? On course to graze Callisto and die ugly on Europa. She called Admiral Noah Calder from the subterranean command deck in Nevada, a man whose patience had trained whole generations of officers to love the long game. He asked 3 questions in a voice that never got louder, any sign of pursuit, any response to hails, how long until it touched something we love. The answers came, unknown, none hours, not days. Dispatch Solace, he said. They're our humanitarian hull for a reason, and Asia waked the network politely. Politely meant defense platforms breathing after decades of monkish sleep. It meant the Wisp fleet, the ships the galaxy didn't know we had, warming their phase coils. It meant Earth was done pretending we were only a dot with oceans. Solace burned for the wounded warship from an orbit above Mars. Captain Elias Brooks made rescue work sound like an invitation to a quiet party. Docking arms extended, 0G boarding team away. She's got air in pockets, only pressure ankles deep, and Commander, this isn't heat damage. Something's drained their core like a vampire. Asia watched helmet feeds, corridors where frost climbed like ivy, hegemonic crew with scales gone chalky, emergency lamps silent as old suns. Near the ship's heart, the boarding team found a device the color of ice seen through closed eyes. Sometimes crystalline, sometimes pale, sometimes an ache in peripheral vision. Dr. Miriam Ocampo, whose degrees read like the table of contents of a future encyclopedia, breathed out her whole air tank at once. It's not just a power unit, she said. The field is topologically wrong, like it folds through itself. I'm hearing, God, I know I'm not, voices. Stress, Captain Brooks said because he was kind. Or resonance. Or both, Miriam said because she was honest. They found a survivor with a commander's crest, a hegemonic officer named Verkoth, jaw like a cliff, pupils thin in the camera light. He refused sedation until he had grabbed Brooks's wrist and growled his truth through a translator that seemed ashamed of its job. Not Confederation, Verse said. Not us. The hollow choir. They eat light until there is only their song. The device? Asia asked when the message drifted across the Sol system like ash. Keystone, Ver rasped. We stole from their shrine ships. We thought weapon. He coughed, a serrated sound. Hunger doesn't mind thieves. It follows what belongs. Miriam's scanners drew graphs that shouldn't have been beautiful and were. Energy slept inside the thing like a heartbeat composed by geometry. Threads extended, faint as regret, into directions the math called elsewhere. When she recorded a low-band sample of the field, her headphones filled with sobbing that wasn't quite sound. Not words, not random, memory with the serial numbers filed off. What do you think? Asia asked. Miriam held the device in her eyes and let fear make her careful. I think somebody has been inventorying minds. The outer array screamed then, a kind of polite scream, numbers stacked neatly under the terror. 12 negatives arrived at the edge of our maps, absences shaped like ships, holes whose shadows were louder than their mass. The gravities around them pinched and unpinched, like muscle twitches in a dead god. They are not on any wavelength I taught at the academy, Soren said softly. Admiral, Aisha said over the command net. We have 12 someones who think vacuum is a door, and sir, 2 more signatures rising. Confederation and hegemony both at the drive, both broadcasting perfect righteousness. They want the rock we just pulled from the crocodile's teeth. People always want the same things when they're frightened, Admiral Calder said. Leverage, scapegoats, and maps. Get solace home. We don't start a war, we do not feed the choir. On Europa's plain, the hegemonic dreadnought arrived without ceremony, a streak, a bruise, a continent-wide reminder that gravity's humor is cruel. But by then the real story was already inbound, a vanguard of absence, a pair of righteous navies, and the end of Earth's long, disciplined silence. Aisha stood again at the glass and thought of the old philosophers. Justice without courage is paperwork. One had said, courage without justice is simply speed. She palmed the intercom. Luna to all stations, bring the wisps to ready, medical bays on alert, signal diplomatic channels with polite refusals. This is not the day humanity learned to fight. This is the day we remembered why we try not to. Behind her, the stars kept their small, blistering indifference. In their patient light, the hollow choir came singing. The Confederation arrived with banners on their hulls and clauses in their mouths. Admiral Sel Anvara's face, violet skin, eyes like polished storm, filled the screen over Nevada Command. Earth, she said in perfect English, the kind taught to diplomats who expect to be obeyed. You possess a forbidden object. For the safety of sapience, surrender it to the Confederation within 48 hours. Seconds later, the hegemony's war leader spoke without preamble. Threxer, whose title translated best as the fist that makes thunder happen, misted the camera lens with his contempt. Return what our blood bled for, humans. We will take it from your corpses otherwise. Admiral Calder sighed in a way that suggested he had been expecting this conversation since the day he took his oath. We are neutral, he said, and did not add for now. The Keystone remains in quarantine. We will not hand it to anyone who treats our home as a bargaining chip. They will call it arrogance, Aisha murmured on the private channel. They will call it Tuesday, the Admiral replied. At the edge of the solar system, the absences resolved into shapes the cameras hated. They were not black. They were the color that black thinks of when it dreams about being empty. Their silhouettes crawled as if they did not always agree with themselves. Where they passed, the solar wind's whisper turned off. Wraith, Choir, Null. Soren tried on names as if one might reduce terror to a file folder. Don't baptize nightmares, Aisha said. Just measure them. The wisp fleet did not vanish so much as slip. A phase coil hum you felt in teeth. A smear of light that was more apology than flash. Earth had spent 60 quiet years building ships that could step aside from reality, because war in the 20th century had taught us that the biggest gun is rarely the wisest tool. The wisps emerged inside firing arcs no one else could reach, inside shield geometries designed against straight lines and impatience. Rules of engagement, Aisha said to 70 captains who loved their vessels with an engineer's piety. Disarm, don't slaughter. Demonstrate capability without humiliation. We are not here to teach lessons. We are here to stop people from dying. Copy, said Captain Brooks from Solace back at dock, watching with clenched jaw and loose hands. If they shoot first, we shoot smarter. The first volley in the solar system's first modern battle didn't look like a battle so much as a stage trick. A wisp named Kindness appeared inside the electromagnetic ribs of a Confederation cruiser, whispered a bouquet of quantum torpedoes into the joints of the reactor, then leached itself back into the thin place no one could map. Shields meant to deflect were useless against ammunition that had begun the conversation already inside the room. Disable confirmed, came the calm of a dozen voices. No core breach, crew alive. The hegemony reacted with predictable fury and admirable speed. Threxer's flagship spun a net of gravitic lances that dragged its space like hooks in fabric. 2 wisps staggered, 1 bled sparks and pride. Let them earn your respect, Calder said, and there was iron in the softness. Not your imitation. But the door that had knocked was still knocking. The hollow choir moved not like a fleet, but like a rumor spreading. One brushed the wreck of the hegemonic dreadnought on Europa from 10 million kilometers away. Sensors reported the ice sighing, the metals forgetting how to conduct electricity, a little pocket of physics where energy remembered it could be tired. Test Aisha, Miriam asked over the data line. She stood in a lab beneath Tycho, the keystone suspended in a cradle of fields and hope. I want to see if our phase resonance is not only stealth but antibiotic. You want to shoot them with the same math we use to hide, Aisha said. I want to see if absence can hurt absence, Miriam said, and pressed send on her proposal before courage could finish arguing with caution. Command authorized a single shot. Aisha took defiance herself into a shadow near the lead choir vessel's curl. She felt the coil ripple in her bones. She thought of Maimonides and the old just war arguments. Last resort, right intention, proportionality. She thought of all the lectures she'd attended that ended with the phrase, "We hope never to need this." The torpedo wasn't spectacular. It was a handshake extended at the wrong angle, a polite refusal to obey certain expectations. It hit the choir vessel where its outline forgot to be consistent. For the first time since they arrived, one of the absences made a sound. Direct effect, Soren said, voice hoarse. They are not ghosts, they are survivable. Or they learn, Miriam said, already rewriting code. Absence adapts. Admiral Anvra watched her flagship's escorts go dim but not dead under human mercy. She asked for parley faster than her doctrine would have normally allowed. Threxer, too proud to speak first, swallowed pride because extinction ruins good stories. Earth, Anvra said, eyes heavy now with something other than entitlement. Assist us. We will cease our claim on your world for now. Threxer's turn, we don't kneel, he growled, but we do not waste soldiers on a problem someone else can bite better. Aisha glanced at the Admiral's window. History's hinge squeaked. All Wisp captains, Calder said. New tasking, protect the people who wanted to kill you an hour ago. Don't wait for them to deserve it. It wasn't sainthood. It was strategy braided with ethics, the kind that bends history without breaking the people caught under it. Wisps interposed, threw themselves into songs that wanted to erase the staff as well as the notes. Rescue boats, ours, theirs, crossed lanes like blood cells. Defiance lost a coil and a third of her paint, kept her crew and sense of humor. In the aftermath of that first day, the solar system smelled different in the logs. We had fought not to win, but to keep the game from being as stupid as it wanted to be. Calder convened a council in a Tycho bunker built to survive a dozen bad decisions and one good miracle. Miriam wheeled in the keystone in a cage of silver fields. It's not a bomb, she said. It's a parish register written by physics, not just coordinates, voices. It's a network of stored minds. Prison, Aisha said. Pantry, Verkoth croaked from a med-cot, and if shame could be translated, it appeared in the translator's sudden crackle. We stole their front door. We did not know they had filled the cellar with souls. Aisha thought of the old historians again, Thucydides with his cool prose about power and fear, Frederick Douglass with his hot prose about power and responsibility. We need a new kind of plan, she said, the kind that turns rules into a weapon the monsters can't learn to use. Maps first, Miriam said, lifting the keystone like a candle at a vigil. Then we decide if courage is large enough to be merciful. The Tycho lab was a forest of instruments and compromises, and the keystone in its cradle was a star that had not yet admitted it would explode. Dr. Miriam Ocampo fed it careful questions and got back answers like funerals humming. With Verkoth stable and ashamed and occasionally helpful, she teased a picture out of noise. The map that bloomed in the air was not 2D or 3D, but grief-dimensional. Dark petals where systems had gone missing, threads that were not lines but histories binding species to their neighbors. In the emptiest places, a structure that refused to be fully seen pulsed, like watching a heartbeat through a blanket, the Maw Loom. Between galaxies, Miriam said, not outside space, just somewhere our math doesn't like to visit. And the voices? Aisha asked because she needed to know whether her nightmares had names. Not disembodied, Miriam said. Dislocated, stored with tags. The choir doesn't just consume, it catalogs. Admiral Anvera and War Leader Threxer studied the map like enemies who had both just learned to read. Pride warred with fear on their faces, each losing in turn. Anvera pointed with a finger that did not shake. If it is between, shields designed for within are wrong tools. Your ships step aside from reality. Can they step into that? Our coils phase into near space, Aisha said. Edges, not gulfs. What you're asking is not ghosting through a wall. It's choosing a different house. Could you, Miriam asked quietly, if 1,000 trapped minds knew where the back doors were and whispered the locks to you? The ethical parliament began, a circle of representatives from Earth's coalitions, 2 confederation councils, and 3 hegemonic clans. History does not remember speeches that begin with "we have no choice" and end with "and so we will be kind," but that was the shape of the thing. The voices in the keystone had grown clearer as Miriam refined her algorithms. Some begged to be released into nothingness. Some wanted bodies again. Some only wanted the choir to be stopped so that other songs could be sung. Is it murder to let them go? A Confederation jurist asked. Is it cruelty to hold them because we find their information useful? Replied an Earth ethicist, secular and stubborn. Consent matters even after suffering. Does consent survive captivity? A hegemonic scholar muttered, surprising everyone with his care. They built a framework. Free what wanted freedom, offer embodiment to those who wished it and for whom the math would not shatter. Preserve the right to silence for minds that needed rest rather than resurrection. It wasn't perfect. Nothing involving love and trauma ever is. But it was a beginning that smelled like dignity. Admiral Calder's strategy sleeve unfolded. We take a joint fleet, he said. We make the choir pause, the wisps punch holes, your ships pour through with shields tuned to our phase spill. Dr. Ocampo interfaces at knife range and begins the great undoing. He glanced at Miriam. We don't call it that in writing. We call it repair, Miriam said, because words shape deeds and then return as mirrors. Verkoth asked permission to speak. His translator had learned his cadences and dropped some of the gravel. When we raided the shrine ship, he said, eyes not meeting anyone else's, we found inscriptions. The choir were first. They were starving, and they cut their ethics to make clothing. It fit at first. Then it was the only garment they owned. History lesson, Aisha murmured to her recording drone. Ethics can be a survival tool or a diet. Starving people make soft tyrannies for themselves. The fleet assembly became a history lesson in another key. Confederation cruisers docked with hegemonic destroyers and argued over bolt threads and prayer times and mess spices. Earth's wisps slid between them like cats in a hospital smoothing. That last metaphor made the rounds until it turned into a sign that read PET the ghost ships for luck. Someone taped it over a hatch. Superstition is just morale with a sense of humor. On Luna, a memorial took shape for the crews we had already lost. Names in light, projected against the regolith. Aisha visited after a 14-hour shift and kept her helmet on so no one would see her speak to the names like a priest at the earliest dawn. Thank you for buying us this much future, she said. We promised to spend it with care. On Earth, 1,000 schools watched a carefully edited broadcast about consent and courage. Children asked whether the freed minds would come home. The answer was complicated, so the educators used a story about sea turtles and storms. And it worked because stories about the sea always have. Miriam refined the interface array. It looked like a crown if you were sentimental and like a torture device if you were clinical. The voices in the keystone taught her more efficient protocols because the best students are often the dead. She wept once, privately, when a cluster that called itself the Archive asked to be freed first so it could stop remembering the screams in high fidelity. "You were librarians," she whispered. "So are we." "Then do your job," they answered, and in the lab a printer extruded a component she had been trying to conceptualize for a week. Admiral Anvra visited Aisha in the Wisp hangar, asked to see Defiance's coil. She touched it the way one touches a horse one once feared. "We are not built to ask for help," she said. "Neither are we," Aisha said. "We learned because not learning killed people." Threxer came later at Night Cycle, explained that hegemony proverbs did not include the concept of humble winning. "When we are done," he said, "I will teach them that new phrase. Teach them by example." Aisha said, "We'll spot you." The plan left a taste like copper on every tongue, between galaxies, inside the loom where songs became policy and policy became hunger. Old strategists wrote letters to their children and new ones wrote letters to themselves. And then there was nothing left but countdowns, checklists, and the quiet way people who love one another look at faces they might not see again. Miriam locked the keystone into the interface cradle. It pulsed once as if recognizing a cousin in the dark. "Map loaded," she said. "Signatures tagged. Consent flags set. If we're right, the choir will hear us coming and may open the door." "If we're wrong?" Calder asked. "Then we will make a new door," Aisha said, because it was her job to say it, and because every era needs at least one honest lie to get out of bed. The void between galaxies is not black. It is the color of paper before a child chooses a crayon. The joint fleet slid into it like a guilty thought. Wisps led in a chevron that only existed from certain angles. Confederation and hegemony ships braided behind, their shields tuned to catch the phase spill the wisps shed like pollen. The choir watched from the margins, not attacking, keeping pace the way shepherds do when wolves cross their hills. "Corralled," Soren said. "They're putting us on the track they prefer." "Then we will be very interesting at the end of it," Aisha said, because fear without humor becomes superstition. 3 days into the knot place, a sabotage alarm jittered through the hegemonic wing. A reactor spike, sudden, surgical. Threxer took it personally and professionally. The saboteur turned out to be a zealot who had carved the old doctrine into his bones, never ally. He tried to blow his ship rather than share air with former enemies. He failed, and then he lived, and then he had to listen as a human chaplain explained that forgiveness and consequences are not enemies, just neighbors with a fence between them. "We do justice so that mercy has somewhere to sit," the chaplain said. Threxer pretended not to listen and then memorized the phrasing. On day 7, the fleet hit a pocket of memory so dense the ship's lights dimmed as if reverent. The voices in the keystone rose to a chorus. Miriam wore the interface crown and let her pulse learn to match their rhythm. "We're close," she said. "It's not coordinates, it's permission." The maw loom revealed itself the way a sickness reveals itself after a fever breaks, suddenly, obviously, with a sense that it had always been there. It was not a machine, it was a policy. It stretched in a geometry that would have gotten a freshman expelled from Euclid. It pulsed with work, taking, sorting, storing, humming the world into categories the world would not have chosen for itself. "Firing arcs mapped," Anvra said. "Their outer hull is metaphor," she added helplessly. "I cannot brief my gunnery on metaphor." "You can brief them on weak points," Miriam said, and shoved coordinates like stitches into the battle net. "Gaps salted from inside by the trapped. They have been loosening the screws for centuries." The first pass was art disguised as violence. Wisps slid into the loom's near skin and placed torpedoes with a surgeon's boredom. Confederation beams, staggered, wide spectrum, kept the choir's skirmishers occupied. Hegemonic destroyers did what they were born to do and pretended to hate how good it felt to do it next to former enemies. The choir adapted fast, like any predator whose niche has been challenged. Absence thickened. Sensors went to snow. "Phase frequency match," Soren warned. "They're learning our step." "Change the song," Aisha said. Defiance sang at a frequency that had no business existing, and 3 wisps broke coil tolerances to harmonize. The choir flinched. No one cheered because to cheer is to waste breath. Miriam reached for the loom with the keystone on a leash and 1,000 consents tagged. The contact was not tactile. It was more like negotiating with a weather system. "We're in," she whispered. "The archive is holding the door for us, transfer at 1% and climbing." The choir noticed the theft and howled. The howl was not sound, it was a subtraction of conviction. Anvara's bridge crew lost 2 seconds to doubt and never got them back. 2 ships took hits that erased their names before the letters finished being spoken. "Hold," Calder said, and the word had mass. We knew what we were paying. The freed began to work from within. A cluster of minds that had once been a maritime species took control of a torque node and spun it the wrong way. A choir that had once been judges rewrote a permissions table. A pack of artists shorted out the aesthetic routines that kept the loom beautiful to itself and forced it to see itself as it was. 20%, Miriam said, eyes wet. "They're not cargo, they're colleagues." 40, Soren said. "Incoming wave, they're trying to push us back into within space." "Give them something to push against," Aisha said, and parked defiance like a wedge in the doorway of a dying god. The loom pulsed red, if red can be a temperature in math, and the keystone screamed in all the languages grief employs. Miriam held the crown like a priest holds a relic and remembered the sea turtle story she had told the kids back on Earth. "Find home," she whispered to billions, "or find rest, or find revenge if that is what your ethic requires and your soul can carry without breaking. We will not choose for you." 60, Soren said. 75. The choir stopped being confident and started being clever. They matched phase with 4 wisps at once and reached inside the coils with fingers made of absence. Defiance went blind in one eye. Kindness lost her name and borrowed another. Anvara's flagship took a wound that wrote new physics along its equator. 89, Miriam said through teeth. "We are hitting bandwidth ceilings. If I open more lanes, we risk cross-contamination. If I don't, we leave people behind." "Open them," Calder said. "That wasn't a question," Miriam replied, and opened them. The transfer became a river in flood. Minds skimmed past like fish with opinions. Some splashed thanks at Aisha's bridge. One old beyond metaphor pressed a thought into Miriam's face. "You learn to hide and to help. We forgot the second when the first tasted good. Do not forget." 97, Soren said. 99. The Maw loom had one last idea. If it could not keep its larder, it would at least take the pantry door with it. Fields twisted. Coordinates turned to wet paper. The fleet felt reality buck as if deciding whether to throw them. Threxer rammed his destroyer into a node and quoted the human chaplain under his breath. "Justice, mercy, fence." 100, Miriam said, and let go. The loom didn't explode, it exhaled. The absence softened. The structure collapsed the way institutions do when their victims stop consenting to be furniture. The choir ships around it went limp, like puppets embarrassed to be seen in daylight. Alarms still howled. Fires still ate corridors. Rescue still mattered more than victory speeches. Aisha unbuckled, floated to the viewport, and saw the knot place beginning to ripple in a way that suggested it might soon remember it had somewhere else to be. "Status?" Calder asked, voice thin with travel and too much leadership. "We broke their engine," Aisha said. "We didn't break them all, and sir, the choir is not done wanting. They are only done feasting." "Copy," he said. "Bring our people home." Miriam removed the crown with fingers that trembled only after the work was done. The keystone lay quiet, a stone after a river, and for the first time since we had met it, it weighed nothing more than itself. On every ship, in every sickbay and mess, people looked at former enemies and saw co-workers who had not killed them even when killing would have been easier. That is not friendship yet. It is the soil where friendship grows. The void began to cough them back towards stars. The choir lingered at a distance, regarding with the wary curiosity predators reserved for prey that has learned to carry knives. Aisha closed her eyes and thought of the memorial on Luna and the children on Earth and the old historians in her pocket notes. Silence is noble when it listens and cowardly when it hides. We had been both long enough. Now we had to learn the third thing, to speak in a way that made fewer funerals. She opened her eyes on a shrinking loom and a fleet that had paid for a tomorrow that still needed a lot of work. "Set course," she said, "and someone tell Threxer the phrase he wants is humble winning. He can have it. We'll charge him a proverb and a favor." The choir sang from far away. Hungry and curious, the fleet answered with engine noise and rescue beacons, and the kind of laughter people only make when they are still terrified and very much alive. Gravity felt wrong for a week after the loom exhaled. The fleet's hulls creaked as if they had grown bones where once there had been only ambition. On the way home, no one said victory out loud. Aisha Tran floated through Defiance's night cycle, boots off, listening to the murmur of an exhausted ship, the tick of cooling metal, the whisper of air through filters older than some of her crew. Survival makes its own weather. In Tycho's lab, Miriam Ocampo set the keystone on a table and waited for it to refuse to do anything. It obliged. What had been a map, a pantry list, a prison ledger, now felt like an empty photo frame. She slept for 12 hours, woke to the smell of someone else's coffee, and walked to the observation slit where Luna's dust turns sunrise into a rumor. Verkoth stood there with a cane and a translator that had learned to be kinder. "My clans will not forgive me," he said, not as a complaint, but as weather. "We broke into a god's orchard to steal fruit. I helped. Then teach them what an orchard looks like when the fences are there to keep the trees safe, not the thieves fed," Miriam said. "We cannot unsteal, but we can unlearn." When the fleet crossed into within space, Earth filled every screen with pale blue arguments. Confederation relays and hegemony beacons announced their approach to their own people in tones that were half triumphant, half embarrassed. The choir, what remained of it, trailed at distance like wolves pretending they were clouds. Rescue ships peeled off to deliver wounded to whoever's sickbay would take them. Earth took them all. The first great argument erupted before the last casualty list was compiled. In Nevada Command, a council gathered under flags and folded coats, Admiral Calder at the center, Anvera and Threxer at opposite sides like parentheses. Civic leaders, ethicists, historians, and pilots who smelled like machine oil and stubbornness filled the rest. "What do we do with the freed?" asked Anvera, eyes tired but sharp. "Some want embodiment, some want silence, some want to testify, to shout. We do not have a law for this." "We build one," said an Earth jurist whose hair was white and whose voice remembered Nuremberg, South Africa, and 100 quieter rooms where people chose not to be monsters when no one would have blamed them if they had. A restorative first, retributive only where consent and safety agree. We do not punish to feel powerful. We hold accountable to keep tomorrow from being a rerun. Threxer, surprising himself, nodded. "We also do not let predators write the rules for the herd. Then we write them together," Aisha said, and it felt less like a speech and more like a repair. They drafted the Tycho Concord where the air tasted like regolith and old glue, principles for consent after captivity, the right to silence, a hierarchy of choice for embodiment, a prohibition on loom-like architecture by any name under any flag. The phrases were simple on purpose. Simple words hold better in emergencies. Outside law and light, someone tried to kill the future in the oldest way, by making the present bleed. A Confederation hardliner and a hegemony zealot, strangers until fear taught them the grammar of convenience, slipped into Tycho's lower levels with a plan to seize the keystone and whatever notes Miriam had not already burned into her own brain. They pictured leverage. They pictured a return to the world they understood, which included enemies and trophies and fewer questions. They met a maintenance crew and a medic instead. The crew refused to be furniture. The medic had learned triage on Europa's ice and knew where to aim a stun baton to knock someone down without breaking their history. A security team arrived with non-lethal webs and a lecture. The would-be thieves ended the day in a room with 2 chairs and 4 cups of tea. One cried. One stared at the floor until the floor stared back. "We don't do show trials," Admiral Calder told the press later. "We do public reasoning. We will release the transcripts. We want your children to read them in civics class and argue better than we did." The freed minds made choices. A cluster that once had been a species of mathematicians asked to become an archive. They rewrote themselves into a chorus that could answer questions without telling people how to live. A trio of artists accepted bodies printed in careful flesh and painted the first mural on Luna anyone agreed was worth keeping. An ancient judge asked for silence and got it. Her consent form was 1 sentence and 4 pages deep. Aisha toured the new wing at Lagrange 5 where the embodied would recover and the silent would not be disturbed. She stopped at a window where Earth rose like an apology. Soren Patel stood beside her, looking older by a decade and better for it. "You know the thing I keep replaying?" he asked. "The way we told our captains, disable, not massacre. We could have made more wrecks. We made fewer ghosts. Compassion is not a ceasefire with evil," Aisha said. "It's a strategy for keeping your soul while you work." Solace returned to Europa to comb the dreadnought's grave for clues and closure. Captain Brooks found a folded scrap of someone's uniform with a child's drawing stitched inside, 2 suns and something that might have been a boat. He placed it in a vacuum-sealed archive with a note, "Please deliver to whoever survives this." He did not know who would open it. He did it anyway. The choir sent a message that was not an attack, a ripple at the edge of physics, a statement in a language that tasted like apology and warning. Miriam translated it into 3 sentences. "We are fewer. We are hungry. We are learning to be something else." "Then we will leave lights for you," she said to the empty lab. Traps, lighthouses. A memorial service on Luna surprised everyone by not being pompous. Children read the names. A hegemony singer mourned in a register that made machinery ache. Anvor and Threxer stood side by side and did not perform friendship or rivalry, merely the truth that neither had all the answers anymore. Admiral Calder spoke last and shortest. "History will not remember all the smart things you did because you did not die," he said to the living. "That is the point of smart things. Keep doing them." The Tycho Concorde passed not because the powerful embraced it, but because the exhausted decided they could not bear another century of clever cruelty. The first signature was a nurse's. The second was a machinist's. The third was Threxer's claw. The fourth, Anvora's steady hand. Calder signed as a witness, not a savior. In the same hour, sensors caught a flicker on the rim. Choir remnants testing themselves against a quiet mining colony in the dark between named places. The Joint Ops channel lit with the only sentence that had any business surviving all of this. "We go," Aisha said. "Bring the lights." They called the network the Lighthouse Array because the name made admirals and schoolchildren nod at the same time. Each node was a small moon of instruments. Phase beacons tuned to sing the way the loom had sung to its prisoners, but inverted, an invitation to safety instead of a summons to storage. Atop each, a tower of simple radio for the species who preferred their physics with fewer adjectives. The first array outpost went live above a rim colony nobody wrote songs about. The place was all practical angles and the smell of dust that had opinions about lungs. Earth engineers laid cable beside hegemony welders. Confederation logisticians discovered humor in inventory for the first time. At dusk cycle, they held classes in the common room. Consent law next to shipboard botany. First aid next to the history of treaties that had worked long enough to justify their postage. The choir shard arrived at midnight as if punctuality were part of their new ethic. It felt along the array's skin like a blind hand on a doorknob. The node sang back in soft refusal. The shard recoiled, then adapted. It reached deeper, tried to twist the phase signature into the old hunger key. Defensive posture. Soren called from defiance as the wisp wing formed a crescent between the node and the dark. Remember our Rule 2. Rule 2 had been written on a napkin during the worst night of the loom fight. We do not teach our enemies by hurting our friends. It meant no dramatic explosions near civilians, no proud physics experiments inside school zones, no heroics that taste like collateral damage. A wisp named Patience took the first handshake, compressing her phase into a pin and jamming it into the shard's outline where it fuzzed. The shard split like a thought reconsidered. Two smaller absences veered for the colony's reactor, calculating that if they could not have the pantry, they could at least spoil the kitchen. Trajectory locked, Aisha said. Soren, I want a net. He had written the net program after watching a child at the memorial braid their fingers into a cat's cradle. It threw phase filaments across knot space like spider silk. The filaments caught the shardlets and held them until they stopped being two things and remembered they had once been one. Patience slid a torpedo into the seam. The detonation was quiet math. Minimal spill, Soren reported. Radiation below background, the school hydroponics will survive. Then so will we, Aisha said, Miriam's team, now called the Archive Sanctuary by everyone except its grant writers, watched from Luna and learned. The shard had tested a new trick, parallax storms, where local reality looked at itself from a slightly incorrect angle. If left unchecked, such storms turned hallways into cul-de-sacs and doors into insults. She wrote a patch for the array that taught nodes to recognize parallax as a cry for help rather than an attack, then to answer by offering coordinates that made ethical sense. What are ethical coordinates? Anvera asked during a briefing. Places a being can stand without stepping on someone else, Miriam said. Places with exits that are not traps. The second array node went up near a Confederation pilgrimage world. Priests blessed it with words that tasted like home. The third hung over a hegemony shipyard where apprentices learned the difference between strength and cruelty by breaking bolts and bad habits. The fourth floated in Earth's sky on an orbit that let schoolkids wave when it crossed the dusk. The fifth watched a stretch of nothing everyone now thought of as a road. Between deployments, the fleet learned to do something harder than winning. They learned to respond. Aisha drilled her captains on the ethics of first contact with freed minds who woke from silence, furious and articulate. One demanded trial, not of their captors, but of themselves. They had served the choir for 1,000 years, convincing themselves that survival justified anything. They wanted a court to tell them whether forgiveness could be earned and whether it should be. The court said what decent courts say when truth is in a wheelchair and justice has a cold. We don't know, but here are the steps that look like honesty. Threxer returned to his clans and told the story of a chaplain with a fence. The young listened. The old glowered, then asked to meet the chaplain. He came. He brought a thermos and a parable about sheepdogs who learned to be librarians in their off hours. The clans laughed at the wrong places and then stopped laughing altogether when they realized they had understood. Anvera took a tour of the array. At the rim node, she stood beneath the tower while wind tried on her uniform like a dare. I still don't like that you can be inside my ship without a door, she told Aisha. You like that we keep leaving, Aisha said. That's the part people forget to notice. The choir shardlets grew rarer. Some came to the nodes and hovered, not attacking, and then left after a few minutes like teenagers peeking into a class they weren't sure they were ready to take. Aisha logged each visit as a conversation, not an event. She sent the logs to Miriam, who sent back small notes. You can hear curiosity under the static if you listen sideways. The array's 10th node was scheduled for a sky with no name when the alert hit. A hegemony research group had gone missing near a decommissioned shrine ship. Recon showed scaffolding like bones and power signatures that smelled of forbidden ambition. Array telemetry detected the old loom math dressed in a new flag. Project Grindstone, a Threxer said when the file crossed his desk. He did not let his hands shake. Ours, or at least ours who want the old speed back. The array did not shoot. It illuminated. It showed who was doing what, where, and why, and then shined that light through every channel that mattered. Grindstone's architects had to answer questions before they could lie effectively. Bring the wisps, Calder said. Bring a warrant, bring patience. We will not build the future by kicking in every door. Aisha checked Defiance's coils, told her crew to sleep while they could, and wrote one more line on the rules board: "We do not become the thing we stopped." Then she erased an older line about impressive explosions and did not miss it. The lighthouses held. The choir learned to circle rather than pounce. The Rim colony held a festival under a sky that had once tried to be hungry. Children ran under strings of lights that told ships where safety was. Anvra danced and pretended not to. Threxer tried and failed and didn't care. Aisha watched, not as a commander calculating wind speeds and escape routes, but as a person who had earned 40 minutes without worrying. When the message came, the coordinates, the signatures, the confession disguised as scientific abstract, Aisha's face hardened in a way that meant sleep was postponed. "Grindstone moves at dawn," Soren said, reading the feed. "Then we move sooner," Aisha said, "and slower, bring every light we own." The decommissioned shrine ship hung against a gray star like a moral problem. Grindstone had bolted scaffolds to its flayed skin, built labs where prayers had once been catalogued. Inside, 1,000 kilns glowed at patient temperatures, each coaxing old math into new obedience. The plan was simple, which is to say cowardly. Build a small loom, just enough to threaten, then call it deterrence. Threxer met Aisha at the staging point with a face that looked like someone had sanded it. "My cousin commands the site," he said. "If I fail to arrest him, I lose my clan. If I arrest him, I lose my clan." "Or you keep it," Aisha said, "because the young watch the old for signs of adulthood." He barked a laugh. "Humans put a lot of faith in children. We are good at being them and bad at letting them down." The plan they brought to Grindstone would have made a bad holovid. No explosions, no hero shot. Aisha's wisps would ghost the power trunks and whispers sleep into circuits. Threxer would walk in the front door with 2 witnesses and a copy of the Tycho Concord under one arm. Anvra's frigate would stand off with her shields lowered enough to demonstrate trust and raised enough to repel stupidity. "Broadcast everything," Calder ordered. "We do not do right in secret." At H-0010, Grindstone's sensors noticed the wisps and did what paranoia does, overreacted. Alarms drove techs into rehearsed corridors. Aisha swore softly and adjusted the net to catch panicking systems rather than disabling them. "We are not here to make martyrs," she reminded herself out loud, as if her own voice were a lever. Threxer strode into the main hall flanked by a human chaplain and a Confederation jurist. His cousin stood at the far end behind a lectern built to look like a pulpit. He had chosen the optics poorly. "Cousin," the commander said, "you come with strangers and paper." "I come with lights you refuse to see," Threxer said, holding up the Concord. "And witnesses, because truth deserves chaperones. You would kneel to those who starved us." The cousin roared, and behind the rhetoric Aisha heard the familiar music of fear. "We partnered with those who helped us feed our children," Threxer replied. "And you plan to build the abattoir again because it feels safer when the knife is in your hand." The broadcast carried their words into kitchens and barracks and lecture halls across 3 civilizations. Miriam watched on Luna with her hands wrapped around a mug so tightly the ceramic squeaked. Anvra stood on her bridge and did not blink. Aisha's wisps slid through Grindstone's guts like gentle fingers, tripping breakers, slowing turbines, whispering boredom into the parts of the machine that wanted drama. Soren's net diverted a surge that might have turned a lab into a funeral. Techs who had signed up to feel powerful found themselves holding clipboards in a room whose power had chosen not to obey. "Arrest me then," the cousin sneered. "Make a spectacle." "You will not be the spectacle," Threxer said. "The Concord will be, we built a law that does not need to kill to be believed." He handed his cousin the paper. The cousin read enough to find out whether reading might damn him. It didn't. It just made his arguments smaller in his own ears. "I thought you would enjoy the old speed," the cousin whispered, low enough that the broadcast soft-muted the words until an engineer boosted the gain. "Rules ruin clarity. Rules make it possible to look at yourself tomorrow," Threxer said. He gestured. Guards, hegemonic, not human, took his cousin's weapons and led him away. The man did not thrash, he did not confess, he did not break. He merely looked like someone who had discovered that history had stopped taking his calls. Aisha exhaled only when the lab status board went entirely green. She sent in medics to check for foolish burns. She sent in auditors to check for clever lies. She sent a thank you to the WISP captains whose coils hummed with a fatigue that would take a week to sleep. She added a line to the rules not for her bridge, but for her heart. We use patience like a tool, not a disguise. Back on Earth, the arguments began in earnest. Deterrence sells, mercy rents. Whole channels devoted to the catechism of fear read out their litanies. If we had our own loom, we would never be hungry again. Philosophers and math teachers and veterans wrote back. The appetite grows with the secret. Every doomsday machine believes it will retire gracefully. None do. Calder walked out of a committee meeting that wanted a classified addendum to the Concorde, just in case, and into a classroom in Des Moines where 12-year-olds were constructing parallax maps out of yarn and pins. "What's the difference between power and capacity?" he asked. "Power is what you can do that scares people," a kid said without looking up. "Capacity is what you can do that helps them. Which one makes more friends?" "Capacity," a chorus replied. "Power makes allies until it doesn't." He re-entered the committee room and said, "I've just been briefed by the only experts who matter." Grindstone's case proceeded in public. The cousin argued that the loom would have deterred predators and preserved lives. The court heard him out and then read from the Concorde, "You do not preserve life by threatening to erase it. You do not end hunger by building better teeth." He was sentenced not to exile but to work, teaching in shipyards about failure modes, lecturing on what urgency does to ethics. It was not a punishment designed to please the furious. It was designed to protect the future. Anvera visited the shrine ship after the raid and placed her hand on its hull. "You were a church," she said. "Then a factory, now a classroom." She liked the last word best, not because she was sentimental, but because classrooms have doors that swing both ways. The choir watched all of this from a distance and sent one more impossible telegram. "We saw you arrest your hunger. We are watching your appetite." The message contained a set of coordinates that resolved, after 3 sleepless nights in the sanctuary, into a structure in near space, a place where the choir had once dumped broken math. It now vibrated with trapped energy and bruised intent. A weapon if fed, a warning if starved, a library if listened to. "Choice," Miriam said to Aisha, to Anvera, to Threxer, to Calder. "It was always about choice. We choose light," Aisha said. "We choose work. And we choose to sign in public," Calder added. "Enough committees, it's time." They signed under a sky that remembered every launch and every funeral. The Concorde of quiet skies fit on 12 pages and in 2 pockets. The first clause forbade looms and their cousins in any language clever enough to dodge a bylaws committee. The second created the lighthouse array as a commons, funded by all, owned by none, accountable to children who hadn't been born when the loom loosened its teeth. The third protected the freed minds as persons rather than assets. The fourth specified how to argue, publicly, patiently, with the assumption that your opponent is not a monster unless they insist. Threxer signed with a stylus that clicked like a trigger, and then refused to think of it that way. Anvera signed and passed the pen to a teenager from the Rim colony who had grown lettuce under a sky that once tried to be a menu. Admiral Calder signed last and wrong-handed, leaving a smear that made him grin. "Let it be imperfect," he said. "Perfect things break when they meet time." The choir sent delegates. They did not wear bodies so much as borrow them, hollow synths that glowed faintly where words would soon need to stand. They called themselves monitors because they had learned the human and hegemonic words for watcher could mean predator or guardian depending on context. The monitors agreed to seat 3 in the Concorde Council, not as rulers, not as plaintiffs, but as witnesses sworn to say when hunger began to pretend it was policy. Miriam Ocampo took a smaller job with a grandiose name, Keeper of the Sanctuary. She taught classes that were part engineering, part ethics, part grief counseling. She asked students to write letters to themselves 10 years in the future explaining why they hadn't built a new loom, even though it seemed like a good idea at the time. The letters were folded into a wall that warmed the room like a furnace made of paper courage. Aisha declined a promotion that would have made her a chair and accepted one that let her stay a captain with more paperwork. She built a syllabus for WISP captains, just war history beside practical coil maintenance, case studies on non-lethal boarding beside poetry that knew something about mercy. In the margins, she wrote, "We win when we keep promises to the dead and the living at the same time." Soren Patel built an open-source library of phase math and ethics footnotes. He called it the cookbook as a joke, and then didn't because words matter. He added recipes for nets that catch without strangling, for songs that admit there is more than one key, for navigational tables that estimate regret and route around it. Solace did what ships named Solace do. She carried medics and school teachers and magistrates to places that had given up on seeing themselves as part of the map. Captain Brooks learned how to cook 2 stews that tasted like home to species whose taste buds had been designed by different oceans. He hosted dinners where enemies learned how to say pass the salt in one another's dialects, which is how treaties become habits. Anvera returned to worlds that had worshipped her hull and said, "We were wrong about some things." She did not abdicate command when she said it. She reinforced it. Authority that admits error is stronger because it can turn. She taught officers to lower their shields in tiny ways long enough to hear a warning that sounded like insult. Threxer went home to a clan that expected him to be either a traitor or a statue. He was neither. He was a man who had learned that strength without direction is wind. He sat with the young and asked them what scared them. He wrote a proverb to sit beside the old ones. Humble winning is the kind that lasts. The clans rolled it on their tongues and found it useful in arguments about budgeting. The first array graduation took place under a dome hung with lights that blinked in a pattern that meant welcome in 3 languages and be careful in a 4th. The valedictorian was a being who had been a voice in the loom for 900 years and a body for 9 months. They spoke softly and ruined no one. "We are not a miracle," they said. "We are what happens when people choose a hard rule and a generous practice at the same time." Aisha visited the memorial on Luna quarterly because ritual is a kind of maintenance. She added a line beneath the oldest names, "We kept your receipts." It made her smile every time. Beside the memorial, a small museum displayed the crown Miriam had worn when the loom cracked. Children put on 3D-printed copies and declared with King's seriousness that they would not be cruel. The monitors offered a gift on the Concorde's 1st anniversary, a star map of warnings. Beyond the rim where the loom had fed, further out than the choir had ever claimed, there was a cough in the dark. Not hunger this time, not song, something like a silence that did not mean peace. "New neighbors," Miriam said, "or old neighbors returning our stare. Do we build bigger guns or better chairs?" Anvera asked, and everyone knew it was not a joke. "Both," Aisha said, "but we sit down first." The Concorde passed a budget that put more money into translators than torpedoes and more into phase coils than speeches. The array grew. The Rim Colony held another festival and invited the choir monitors. 3 came and stood awkwardly by the lemonade like uncles at a wedding who had not expected to be loved. They were. It made them terrible dancers and good listeners. On an evening that counted as summer in 3 calendars, Aisha stood in Copernicus Crater's gallery again. The glass wore stars like literature. Admiral Calder limped in with 2 cups of coffee and that squint that meant he had forgiven the universe for being noisy. They watched ships come and go, wisps like punctuation, freighters like patient sentences, scout vessels riding footnotes into the dark. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" he asked. "The quiet we had was hiding," she said. "I like this kind better. It has work in it." He nodded and said nothing more because wise men learn when to let a line be the last line. Below them, the memorial's names glowed, not brighter, just steady. Above them, the array's beacons blinked the only sentence any lighthouse ever needs to say: "We are here. Adjust course. Welcome." The choir hovered at the edge of sensors sometimes. They did not pounce. They did not beg. When they sang, it sounded less like want and more like wonder. Newly freed minds chose silence or jokes or jobs. Grindstone turned into a school where deterrence was taught as a temptation one resists out loud. The Concord argued in public, amended bad clauses, replaced brittle rules with flexible ones, kept the parts that worked. It was a government that blushed when it lied and fixed itself afterward. Asia sent defiance out on a patrol no one would write down, to a road between stars that had once been an alley for wolves. The Wisp's coil sang a note that promised trouble would not get a blank check. Soren laughed at nothing in particular. Miriam typed a paragraph in a handbook called How to Be Kind with Tools. Threxer officiated a graduation where every new officer received 2 items, a torque wrench and a pamphlet on consent. History does not end. It finds better editors. Earth had stayed out of the Galactic War until the war learned our address. We answered the door with rules and lights and a refusal to be clever at the cost of being good. The galaxy did not become gentle. It became legible. That is enough for people who intend to keep going. On the array, the beacons blinked. In the sanctuary, the archive breathed. In the crater, the glass held. And in the dark between, ships wrote tomorrow in a grammar of engines and restraint, humble winning stitched into their sails like a warning and a dare.